Hi everyone, this is the Chapter 8 overview, and I'm going to go ahead and get started here with slide 11, or I guess it's slide 13. Um, okay, so here we go. Uh, Sorry about that. Okay, so let me try again. There we go. All right, so um, in this chapter, as I said, this is about mental illness, and so if you've already begun reading the chapter, or you've read the chapter, you know that the focus is mental illness. And so there are two types of mental disorders that the medical community regards. The functional disorders and the organic disorders. And organic disorders are not they are caused by something that happens physically to the body. So either brain damage or perhaps a brain tumor, a head injury, um, brain syphilis, because if syphilis is untreated, it will travel up through the spine and into the brain, and it will cause mental illness. Aging, in the case of, say, dementia, which is the umbrella, Alzheimer's under that umbrella of dementia, or drug abuse. Um, However, the vast majority of what we think of when we talk about mental illness is the set of functional disorders. These are disorders that occur. One way to think of it is these occur because of how we live, through our experiences, good, bad, traumatic, etc. And so there are three kinds of functional disorders: the psychotic disorders, neurotic disorders, and personality disorders. And psychotic disorders are disorders that are considered to be mental illnesses in which a person loses touch with reality. And so you look at those two that are listed there, such as schizophrenia, manic depressive behavior, or what we now call bipolar disorder. And so, for example, with schizophrenia, a person who has a schizophrenic episode is essentially in an alternate reality. What they are experiencing during that schizophrenic episode is not what anyone else is experiencing. Um, and I have, over the years, when I was an administrator in higher ed before I started teaching full time, I worked with students who had been diagnosed as schizophrenic, and they often told me that when they are having an episodic, a schizophrenic episode, that that is their reality. They have no idea that everyone else is not experiencing the same thing. Um, Neurotic disorders are actually quite common. In fact, if you were to look in the DSM-5, you'd likely find under neuroses a number of them that you have. Probably all of us have a handful of neurotic disorders, according to the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Several listed here are anxiety reaction, obsessive compulsive behavior, depressive reaction, psychophysiologic disorder. And a neurotic disorder is different from psychotic disorder in this way. As I said, these are very common neurotic disorders. And that's because, unlike the psychotic disorder, where it is a loss of touch with reality, you're in your own alternate reality. With a neurotic disorder, you refuse, at least in the words of psychiatrists, or from the view of psychiatrists, you refuse to accept reality. Okay? You have difficulty with accepting reality. So a very simple example of a neuroses is knowing that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but worrying about it. Okay? So for example, with obsessive compulsive disorder, people know logically, let's take this one, obsessive compulsive disorder, having many locks on one's door. most people believe that having one, maybe two locks on your door is sufficient. So one that is a deadbolt lock, and then one that works with, um, you know, I don't know, the one part that, it's not the deadbolt, but the part that goes into the keyhole that unlocks it. I don't know what you call that. I'm hoping you understand. However, there are some people who are so fearful of their safety that they have multiple locks on their door. And not only that, they might also have a security alarm, and they might also have a security screen door um, on their homes because they're so obsessed with being safe that they go overboard. They know that just having the deadbolt and the other lock is fine, is enough. Maybe having security too, okay. But having multiple locks and then a security alarm and also a security door, they know. They know that it's not logical, and yet they cannot stop themselves. They worry that it's just not true. That's an example. Um, and some of these disorders appear much more today than they did before. For example, anxiety disorder or anxiety reaction. That is something that is far more common today than it was, um, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And one idea that I have read about in terms of explaining why anxiety disorders are so much more common is because of the way in which our world today bombards us with so much information, and some of us, we cannot pull ourselves away from that information. There are people who cannot stop looking at their phones. They cannot stop scrolling. I think that the that shorthand for text that I don't even know what it's called, but all those little like LMAO, laughing my ass off, etc. That fear of missing out, FOMO, that's very real for some people, and so that may create some sense of anxiety for some people. And then personality disorders, these are really focused on this idea that certain people may develop a personality disorder that compels them to engage in behavior that is very antisocial, perhaps even sociopathic or psychopathic. People who engage, for example, in serial killing is a type of psychopathic disorder, or people who torture animals is another psychopathic disorder. The idea is that when this person was developing, their socialization as well as their psyches were damaged. And so they now have a damaged personality. Okay, so I want to focus on some of the social factors in mental disorders. And I also teach a class called social psychology, which is a combination of sociology and psychology, obviously. And there, in that course, there's a focus on the fact that who we are individually because of our psyches, as well as who we are because of our social environments, those two things cannot necessarily be separated. There's an overlap there. And so when we think about the social factors in mental disorders, we recognize that there are factors or characteristics about who we are as individuals that might influence or lead us to being lesser or more likely to develop mental illness. So when we think about social class, there are quite a few studies that show that people from the lower classes are more likely to develop mental illness. However, there's a big however here, caveat. There's a disagreement about why. there's not necessarily a consensus that people who are lower income or who are working class are biologically or physically more prone to mental disorders. There are two ideas that may be factors. One is called social causation and the other called social drift. Social causation is the idea that living in the lower classes, lower class, middle class, the poor, living in poverty, it's very stressful to live in these social classes. Having to always be concerned about, am I going to be able to pay the rent this month? Am I going to be able to pay my utilities? Am I going to be able to buy groceries? My car just broke down, how am I going to fix it? It's stressful to live in modern society and to be bombarded with needs and necessities that you may not always be able to obtain each month. And so, because it is so stressful to live in lower income areas and in lower classes, the idea is that may make people more prone to mental illness. Of course, in addition to that is a lack of adequate health care. Consider that some mental illnesses may be quite mild at the beginning, but if they are left untreated, they may develop into a moderate mental illness and then even to a severe mental illness. However, people in upper classes, middle and upper classes, they are often likely to have health care. Therefore, they often will see their doctors when they realize, hey, I'm having some difficulty here. People who are poor or lower income often don't have that ability to do so. And then the other idea is social drift. People who are from the middle and the upper classes might drift downward into the lower classes as a result of their mental illness. So, for example, somebody who is quite wealthy or middle class may develop a mental illness. However, this person may ignore or deny that they are having some problems. And so that may lead them then to lose their jobs, which may then lead to them losing the nice house they have, maybe the nice car they have, because if you lose a job, you can't pay for those things. So now you have to move to a lower income area. And so the idea is some of those people might drift downward into the lower classes. Again, when we think about gender, again, conflicting studies about whether males or females are more likely to develop mental health issues. However, there generally is agreement that certain kinds of mental illnesses are more likely to develop in women and others in men. So, for example, there are many studies that conclude that women are more likely than men. Again, more likely meaning it's not the rule, there are exceptions, but that women are more likely than men to, when they experience problems, to direct their anger, their frustration, their anxiety inward, which makes them more likely to then develop mental disorders that are inward, things such as depression or anxiety or eating disorders or disorders in which they harm themselves, so cutting, etc. Men, because of their socialization, are much more likely when they do develop issues or problems to turn their anger, frustration, disappointment, etc. outward. And so they may engage in much more aggressive mental health problems. So perhaps harming animals or harming people, etc. And then age. When we think about in the past, elderly people, which were more likely to develop mental health issues. Today, however, what we see is that younger people are much more likely to develop mental illness, some type of mental illness. And as I mentioned earlier, for many younger people, anxiety disorders are not uncommon. Eating disorders are not uncommon. Cutting, not uncommon. And again, it may be due to the kind of society we live in, where we are constantly able to access images of people whose lives are seemingly better than ours. They're smarter than we are, they're prettier than we are, more handsome than we are, thinner than we are, just overall better than we are. And if we compare ourselves to those people, we may begin to become either mildly depressed or moderately depressed, or we may become anxious, etc. And so for younger people today, particularly between the ages of 19 and 34, they are much more likely than people 60 and older to develop mental health issues. And there, I did mention depression, so I want to just quickly touch on the three types of depression: mild, situational, and major depression, or what often is called chronic depression. Mild depression is something we all experience. Maybe we experience it when we don't get that job we really wanted, or we don't get into that college for graduate school that we really wanted, or we, somebody, we get into a disagreement with a good friend of ours, etc. On the other hand, situational depression is more with the situation, right? So maybe it's because we are in a relationship that that doesn't necessarily make us happy, but we stay in it because it's comfortable, and we think, well, maybe no one else is going to want me, so maybe I'll stay in this relationship. But it's situational because of that situation we're in. It's tied to that situation. Or if we have to go to, we're working in a particular job that we don't like, or we perhaps we experience the death of a loved one, or the breakup of a relationship. It's that situation which will pass at some point. And then the major, or the chronic depression. This is much longer lasting, and it comes out of that situational depression, because for some reason an individual just isn't able to move through that depression even after they get out of that situation, even after they leave that unhappy or bad relationship, even after they, months, maybe even years have gone by since the loss of that loved one, etc. Race and ethnicity, again, inconsistent studies about whether people of color are more likely than whites to develop mental illness. Some of the issues here are, when we think about the numbers, just because people of color may seem to have higher rates of mental illness may simply be for a number of factors. Number one, people who are white more often, statistically, the rates of white poverty are much lower than the rates of poverty for blacks and Latinx people. And so, as I said earlier, if you have you have a higher social class, then you're much more likely to have access to healthcare. And so if you're white and you have access to healthcare and you are getting treated, that's not something that necessarily is going to become apparent to anybody unless you tell them. On the other hand, as I said earlier, something that is a mild mental health issue may, left untreated, develop into a moderate mental health issue, and then maybe even severe mental health issue if left untreated. That may be one. Number two, it just seems to me, and I am supported, I think, by this when we think about crimes and the disproportionate rates, supposedly, of whites committing crimes versus people of color, that whites, because of their access to resources, are much more able to hide things that they don't want people to know about them. Whereas if you are a person of color and you don't live in a nice big house, and you live in an apartment where everybody knows your business, then the fact that you may be having some mental health issues will be widely known. But in addition to that, there are some studies that show that groups who experience a lot of stress, they may actually have lower propensity for developing mental illness because of their group solidarity, because of the support network that they have to fall back on. So again, conflicting studies. The urban environment versus the rural environment. Generally, people living in urban areas seem to have more neurotic and personality disorders, but people in rural areas much more likely to develop serious psychotic illnesses. Remember, that's the loss of touch with reality. And again, when you think about living in a big city or living in a metropolitan area like LA, yes, lots of diversity, but lots of traffic, lots of smog, overcrowded, and those are stressors that may cause people to develop a neurosis of one sort or another, where they start worrying about something even though they know it. They know the truth, but they worry about it anyway. Or even a personality disorder. They don't like all of the stimuli around them, and so perhaps they become antisocial. Rural people in rural areas, though, they may be more likely to develop psychotic illnesses, more so because when you live in a rural area, there's not a lot to do. And think about it. If you live in a metropolitan area and you don't want to be by yourself, let's say it's the 4th of July and you don't want to be by yourself. Well, Starbucks is always open. Denny's is almost always open. You could go there and get a meal. You wouldn't be by yourself. You'd be around other people. Or you could go to the Starbucks and get a coffee and you could sit there for hours and study. You wouldn't be by yourself. But when you live in a rural area, there's no Starbucks there. And everything pretty much is closed for a holiday. And if you don't have friends or family nearby, you may feel quite isolated. And the more and more you feel isolated, the more and more you may possibly begin to lose touch with reality. And then PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. People who experience very traumatic things may develop this. And it isn't in the text, it talks about people who go to war, who experience war. But we also know now that it's also people who are survivors of rape or domestic violence, people who are survivors of severe child abuse, people who are in a war zone, even though they are not themselves fighting the war. So you think about Ukraine, for example, think about what those children in those areas, and also other areas where civil war is ongoing. Just growing up with those stressors around you may be quite traumatic to the point that it causes you to have this traumatic stress disorder that is very, very difficult for you to overcome unless you receive medical treatment. All right, so I'm going to go to the perspectives on mental disorder. The medical model is biological in nature. So the idea is, well, mental illness is biological in nature, something going on in the body, therefore should also be treated such the way that physical diseases are treated. And that, of course, would include drug treatment. Psychosocial model, developed by Freud. Freud viewed mental disorders as being due to some unresolved psychic or emotional conflict in a person. And so you probably are familiar if you've taken Psych 101 or whatever number it is at University of Lawrence, its Introduction to Psychology. You know that Freud also identified what he believed were three parts of the personality: the id, the superego, and the ego. And the id, of course, is that irrational, wild, pleasure-seeking part of ourselves. It's the hedonistic part of ourselves. It doesn't care about rules or what other people think, etc. The superego represents morality. And so this is the part of us that is focused on the right and the wrong, as taught to us by our society. And then the ego. The ego is the conscious mind. Right? And that conscious mind, the ego, has to always referee between the other two parts, the id and the superego, because the id is always going to want us to do things that we shouldn't do. But the superego is going to try to rein that id in. And it's the ego, conscious mind, that will referee and make the decision about who wins. And so what Freud argues is that, or argued, because he's long dead, he argued that someone who has a mental disorder has some sort of a conflict, had experienced some sort of an emotional or psychic conflict in their past. It was unresolved. And because the ego did not resolve that conflict, the mind just buried it in the subconscious. So that experience, that unresolved conflict, is still there in the psyche. It's just buried in the subconscious. But that causes people problems in their daily lives. So, psychoanalytic theory, social stress theory, one of my favorites. Again, pointing to this idea that the social stresses of everyday life are significant, particularly in the world we live in today. If you think about, I'm sure you cannot think about this because none of you are this old, but 40, 50, 100 years ago, I hate to say it, but life was seemingly simpler. We weren't bombarded with being able to stream all kinds of things, being able to watch TikTok videos and Instagram, see Instagram pictures and be able to post on Twitter at all hours of the day and read everyone else posts on all of these different social media platforms at all hours of the day. We couldn't as easily compare our lives to that of others the way we can today. And so the social stresses, particularly again of living in a large urban area, metropolitan area like LA or New York or San Francisco, San Diego, Miami, Chicago, etc., it is much more stressful to live in these areas than in many other places in the US. And so, again, those social stresses of everyday life. If you think about how many people go to work, they may go to school, they've got families to take care of, and I know many of you probably fit into this profile that I'm discussing right now. When you go to work, you have school, you may have family, or you may live still with your family, but you have responsibilities with your family. You may be helping to take care of elderly people within the household, or small children, or both. And then, of course, getting to work is an ordeal in itself because of the traffic and near misses on the freeway, all of these things. Then paying bills and just all of it together is quite stressful for a lot of people. And that may contribute to mental health issues. The labeling model is, to me, very interesting, and particularly the ideas of Sauss and Thomas Sauss and Thomas Scheff and Artie Lang. The labeling model is this idea that mental illness is not really a sickness, but it's a label, and that label has been imposed on, some disturbing behavior. There's no doubt about that. But check out what Sauss and Scheff and Lang argue. Thomas Sauss argued that mental illness is a myth. And he criticized the psychiatric community because he said that, yes, troubling behavior occurs in society. Right? There's no argument there. But his argument was that It's the way that the psychiatric community labels these troubling behaviors that creates problems for the person labeled. Sauce viewed mental illness as simply well, not simply, but as either a problem in living or a moral conflict in human relations, or even, depending upon the behavior, a communication expressing some socially unacceptable idea. Thomas Schaff also believed that mental health illness is a myth, but he focused on the idea that there are certain behaviors that aren't criminal, okay? But they're also not socially acceptable. Therefore, society doesn't really know what to do with these people who exhibit these behaviors that are not socially acceptable, but they're not criminal. Therefore, society places them in what Schaff called a type of residual category. And this residual category has come to be called mental illness. Schaff argued that once a person is labeled as having that mental illness, then the impact of the label is such that the person who refuses to acknowledge that they have a mental illness often gets sent to a mental institution where they're treated for a condition that they refuse to accept, and they are continually, while they are in that institution, cajoled or coerced or pushed, whatever word seems appropriate here, to accept the mental illness. And if they can't or don't, then they will remain in that mental health institution. And then finally, R.D. Laing. R.D. Laing, British, a British man who argued, interestingly, I think, and I see that this is a typo, it should be mentally ill. All right, well, who argued that the mentally ill are actually super sane. So his idea was insanity really is not insanity. It's more like super sanity. And here's why, he said, or he argued. He argued that people who are inner oriented, they listen to themselves. They don't care what other people think of them. And I want you to think about it this way. If you've ever seen a small child, maybe who doesn't have a playmate, and they're playing by themselves, they talk. They play both characters. And say a child is playing with two dolls or two G.I. Joe men or action figures, whatever you call those things. I call them all action figures, whether it's for males or females. And so let's say a child is playing with two figures and is acting out some plot in their minds. These two characters are engaged in. Most people would look at that and say, "Oh, how cute!" Playing and acting out some situation. However, Laing argues that at a certain point, we're told that that's not appropriate anymore, and so we learn not to talk like that anymore, not to play both parts of a conversation like we do when we're children, or not to have that imaginary friend. But the super sane, these inner-oriented people, they don't do that. They continue listening to themselves. They continue talking with themselves, which of course causes others to think, okay, they're crazy. And he argued that normal people, supposed normal people, are outer-oriented. They are so focused on social expectations, societal expectations, and conforming to them, that they're willing to forego listening to themselves. They listen to what others say and believe and think. And I want to pose something here. I've used this example before in classes often. In my view, often mental illness maybe is in the eye of the beholder. For example, if you know a friend who has a family member who's sick, you say, perhaps, I'll pray for your family member, or your family member's in my prayers, okay? Or I'm sending prayers. Nobody thinks that's weird. Going to a church or a temple or a synagogue, etc., and going in to pray. Excuse me. Sorry, I know you guys heard that. Also, not weird, right? Because you're going to talk to God. Praying is talking to God. However, here's what's interesting. Again, this is why I say it's in the eye of the beholder. What's interesting is if you pray to God or Allah, whomever, and you tell someone else, hey, I was praying to God or Allah or whomever, and I was asking for advice, and God told me X, Y, and Z, or Allah told me X, Y, and Z. People will think you're weird. They will likely think, okay, this is odd. You're telling me that God was talking to you? Most people are not, they don't view that as a normal thing. But it's okay to pray to God. It's okay to talk to God, just as long as God doesn't talk to you. Something to consider, something to think about. Of course, there are criticisms of the labeling model. Many have pointed out that if mental illness weren't real, then we wouldn't see it across the globe in all cultures and countries, to which Sass and Lang and Sheff, of course, would argue, well, we never said that problematic behaviors aren't in every culture and in every country. Of course they are. And humans have a way of reacting to people who don't follow the norm, the supposed norm, in negative ways, and stigmatizing and labeling them. And of course, that's also what's going on there. So that's it for chapter 8.